Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this short series of videos, I'm here to give you as much practical advice as I can about how to write better dialogue. In the previous episode, I went over how you might approach structuring a conversation scene in order to make it flow better and eliminate redundancies so it doesn't end up feeling like filler. And in that video, I mentioned that you will generally want your characterization to be woven into the fabric of the dialogue so that your characters' personalities can present themselves organically. And in this video, that's what I want to hone in on. As always, I'll be laying down some foundational principles and then move on to more practical specifics. Like so many things in writing, characterization through dialogue is something of a balancing act. On the one hand, giving your characters distinctive voices makes the dialogue easier to follow, and it helps prevent the lines from blurring together into the aforementioned filler. On the other hand, the more you lean into your character's voice, the greater the chance that it starts to feel like a bit of a caricature. Which isn't necessarily as bad as it sounds. Bit characters, in particular, can actually benefit from being painted in broader strokes because they have a very short time to make an impression on the reader, and usually dialogue is the only way they can do that. If you just show your main character conversing with someone who's completely uninteresting, there's a risk that the entire conversation becomes uninteresting, and your reader will start to wonder why you didn't just summarize the whole thing in one paragraph of narration and then moved on to something actually worth paying attention to. So for these one-scene wonders, you can usually allow yourself to have a bit more fun and go a little bit bolder, as much as it makes sense in the context, because even if they end up being too much for the reader, at least they don't stick around for long enough to spoil the whole book. Main characters, on the other hand, are a horse of a very different color, because the reader will be spending a lot of time with them, and if their mannerisms start to become grating, that can be a deal breaker for some people. It has been for me in the past. This doesn't mean that your main character's voice has to be generic or boring. Rather, it means that it should be more nuanced and varied, and in order to pull that off, it really helps to have a solid understanding of who that person is and why they speak the way they do. Now, there are a lot of factors that can go into how a person speaks, so in this video, I'm only going to focus on the three most important ones. The first, and by far most significant of which, is social background. What kind of language environment did this person grow up in, and what kind of language environment do they spend their time in today? Different demographics will have different social dialects, and so the first thing you need to consider is how much your character's expression conforms to their dialect and what it says about them if it doesn't. In A Game of Thrones, we have King Robert, who admittedly isn't a main character, but we spend enough time with him that he becomes something of a co-protagonist with Eddard Stark. Robert is the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, and as such, he's supposed to be the pinnacle of society in general, and nobility in particular. And he, by contrast, swears like a sailor and doesn't give a rat's ass about decorum. This not only makes him more interesting and entertaining to read about, but it also conveys to the reader just how out of place he is. Robert is not fit to be king, and he would be the first person to tell you that if he was drunk enough. So not before 9 a.m. On the other hand, though, depending on your setting, you might also need to consider how realistic it is for your character's expression to diverge from social norms this way. The reason why King Robert is the only one in all of King's Landing who speaks that way is not just because all the other nobles are stuck-up snobs, but also because he's the only one who can get away with it. No one is going to tell the king to mind his manners, but if one of the nobles falls out of line, the rest of them can make sure it has consequences. Similarly, on the flip side, you may write about a character who is a farmer that speaks with such eloquence that they put aristocrats and academics to shame, and it can definitely be intriguing, but it will always beg the question, where does this come from? The second key factor is a character's personality and temperament. As we have just seen, this can be at odds with their social background, but more often than not, it will color their social dialect rather than completely redefine it. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, most, if not all, of the named characters are members of the landed gentry, and as such, they all speak with that characteristic Regency-era flourish. On the surface, this may make them sound completely homogeneous, but if you look a little bit closer, you will find that they actually express themselves in very distinct ways. Lizzie Bennet is direct and no-nonsense. Her father is cordial and down-to-earth. Her mother is histrionic. Lady de Burgh is pretentious and snobbish. And Mr. Darcy is doing his best. And thirdly, one very important factor that so many learning writers seem to forget about is context. So you know how earlier I said that if a character's voice becomes grating, it can be a deal breaker for some people? So a while ago, I tried reading a fantasy novel by a self-published author, but unfortunately, I ended up dropping it less than 100 pages in, because over the course of those less than 100 pages, the main character was at a tavern in a meeting with a prince and his royal council, visiting someone in prison who was wrongfully convicted of murder and sentenced to death, and also fighting off an assassin who came within inches of killing him. And in all of these scenarios, he spoke with the exact same flippant detachment. This kind of thing can work in a cartoon or a satire, but not if you're claiming to depict human beings with human emotions. I kind of get the impression that my reaction to him was supposed to be, oh wow, this guy's so cool, nothing ever phases him. But my actual reaction was, oh wow, I'm not sure if this author knows how to write any other kind of dialogue. People instinctively adjust their manner of expression to their social and emotional context. A lawyer who just got home from work doesn't talk to their spouse the same way they talk to a judge in court, and they don't talk to their spouse who just lost a loved one the same way they do when they're having a night out. There's also a very specific case of this kind of social adaptation, which is known as code switching. People who regularly interact with very different social circles will adopt completely different dialects, and sometimes they will slip between the two whether or not they realize it. So, with those basic principles in mind, what are some of the practical ways you can express character in dialogue? Well, the most obvious and straightforward one is vocabulary and word choice. Does the character say police officer, cop, or pig? Do they use a lot of big words, and do they use them correctly? Do they swear a lot, and if yes, how do they do it? That kind of thing. The other very direct way is composition. Speaking in very long, elaborate sentences reflects a very different personality or a very different state of mind than speaking in terse phrases. But beyond just the length and complexity of the sentences, there's a lot more fine detail you can go into. As a little exercise, think about how many ways you can rephrase this line of dialogue without changing the choice of words. Your brother's a real creep. Do you know that? Do you know your brother's a real creep? Your brother, he's a real creep, you know? He's a real creep, your brother. You know that? A real creep, that brother of yours. Do you know that? These are all technically the same line, and yet not only can you tell that these are different people speaking, but also that two of those people are most likely British. Now, this is not something you need to or even should decide in advance. Rather, I would recommend that you pay attention to yourself as you're writing your dialogue and see if something just really feels natural for the character. As a personal example, in my books, the character Corliss is very quick-witted and he can easily talk circles around people, but you can still see he's a bit rough around the edges because every time he speaks of himself and someone else, he always says me and Thessa instead of the polite Thessa and I. This was not a choice I made ahead of time, but rather something I discovered in the writing process and from that point on made an effort to pay attention to in my editing. Related to the topic of social background and vocabulary and phrasing is the question of foreign characters. How do you convey that someone is supposed to be speaking a language that is not their native tongue? Now, while I understand the practicality of it, I'm personally not a fan of the trope where a foreign character will improvise a complete scientific dissertation in flawless English, but they will still consistently say yes, no, and thank you in their native language. I get why it's done, but it still feels cartoonish. Again, as a personal example, my stories take place in the fictional country of Ardan, where the spoken language is Ardenese. The main character, Tessa, grew up in one of the neighboring countries, and she speaks Ardennes as a foreign language. Now, if you look at her dialogue in the first book, where she is newly arrived in Ardennes, you can actually see that while she is conversationally fluent, her word choices and phrasing are more on the basic side, and there are actually multiple scenes where she struggles to express herself because she doesn't know certain words. Then, as the series progresses, she becomes a lot more confident in not just her language use, but also herself, to the point where she can hold her own in a little back and forth with Corliss. Related, but not exclusive to the subject of foreign characters, is the question of phoneticized accents. This is the practice of using unconventional spelling in dialogue to reflect that someone has unconventional pronunciation. Now, opinions on this are mixed. Personally, I have nothing against the occasional apostrophe or alternate spelling, but I will absolutely say that there is such a thing as too much, and there are two main reasons I don't think it works. The first one is that it is simply laborious to read, especially in a language like English, where the connection between spelling and pronunciation is already tenuous at best. The other problem is one of consistency, because there's only so much you can express just with spelling, the end result of which is that some accents you'll be able to phoneticize, whereas others you will not, even if the other one is a lot thicker and more audible, and this kind of inconsistency can easily come across as singling out or even derogatory. And on the subject of how much you should or shouldn't try to accurately reflect someone's manner of speaking is the topic of naturalistic dialogue. You see, dialogue in fiction is generally exempt from the same stylistic rules that govern descriptions, because, well, people don't speak in crafted prose. On the other hand, though, you can very much observe that people in fiction always speak in complete sentences, which is definitely not the case in real life.
It takes forever getting in, and you spend like 6.5 hours, and then, I can't even get through, I can't even finish the movie. I've never even seen the ending. You've never seen the ending?
I think we can agree, though, that if every dialogue in a book of fiction looked like this, that would probably not be a very enjoyable read. It is therefore generally understood that dialogue in fiction is meant to be a sort of cleaned up, edited version of what the actual humans in the world of the book are saying. If and when you do include these hesitations or broken off sentences, that's usually with the explicit intention to show that someone is struggling to express themselves or that the conversation is becoming chaotic. Now, that said, there is a very specific artistic trend from around the 20th century onward, where authors, typically whose works revolve around social dynamics, will deliberately use naturalistic dialogue throughout their works to really reflect and examine those dynamics in minute detail. So as with so many other things in writing, naturalistic dialogue isn't inherently bad, it just needs to be used with purpose. A specific case of this applies to the genre of fantasy. In its original inception, fantasy was meant to evoke a very romanticized version of the Middle Ages, and therefore characters tended to speak in this sort of pseudo-archaic highbrow manner. Then, as the genre grew, it began to evolve and diversify into more specific subgenres like dark fantasy or low fantasy or hybrid fantasy, which all strive to create very different atmospheres and therefore have very different styles of dialogue. To give a personal example for the last time in this video, my books combine a low fantasy setting with the atmosphere of mid-20th century noir and crime fiction, and the conversations that my characters have definitely reflects that. So once again, as always, the single most important thing is to know what kind of story you are trying to tell. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments, and until next time, stay tuned.